Okay, so we have one chapter left. That's chapter 13. Chapter 13, the first half focuses on development, the second half on health. So this week we're focused on development, and next week we'll focus on health. Now, one of the first homework questions that are due this Thursday asks you to identify 3 different systems that can be used to measure development. And so I'm not asking for 3 different key economic indicators like per capita, GDP or stuff like that. I'm asking for 3 different systems. So one would be kind of that traditional looking at key economic indicators like per capita economic output, per capita gross product. But that's one system. Another system, and the most comprehensive of the 3, would be this one, the Sousa and Porter's 9 objectives of development. And so this one is looking not just at economic indicators, but also non-economic indicators. So that one, number 2, is the most comprehensive of the 3. And I'll finish talking about number 2 before I move on to number 3. So these are the 9 factors that the Sousa and Porter's 9 objectives of development look into. Number 1 is diet. How well do people in a specific country eat? How nutritious is their food? Number 2, medical care. Yeah, how good are the services that people have available to them with regards to health? Number 3, environmental sanitation and control of diseases. So what kind of infrastructure do they have to provide potable water for the public to drink? How good is their sanitation system to prevent the spread of diseases? Number 4, labor opportunities. So do people have opportunities to get jobs? Jobs that help them survive. Learning opportunities, do they have enough schools? Are the schools good enough at the different levels to educate the public? Number 6, safety, freedom of thought, and freedom of religion. So generally, how safe do people feel in a country, regardless of their background, regardless of their ideology, or regardless of their religion? Or are they persecuted for it? 7, housing. How well do people live? Are they protected from the environment? Number 8, a balance between environment and economic production. So not only how well are people doing right now, but is their economy set up in a way where it's sustainable? Or are they just happen to be in a boom that is surely to become a bust in a few years, like mining, for example? And so how sustainable is it? Or if a lot of their economy is dependent on tourism, but they're destroying the environment in the process, they're not going to have a lot of tourists in the future. And so how sustainable is it? Number 9, finally, political and social equality. Is there a significant middle class? Or is it just a small amount of rich people and the masses of poor people? And so how much political and social equality is there? So this is the most comprehensive of the 3. With that said, this third system is the Human Development Index. This one looks at just 3 things, and it's kind of a shortcut of trying to be more comprehensive than looking at just economic indicators. But it's a shorthand, so we're not looking at 9 different things. We're looking at just 3. Those 3 things begin with life expectancy. So it turns out that when people are poor, they're not only having a lower quality of life, they're also literally having a shorter life. And so it's not just about quality of life, it's also length of life. Poor countries tend to have a lower life expectancy. People die younger. Educational attainment. How educated is the population of a given country? And that has implications about opportunities, upward mobility, stability, has a lot of implications that one measure can imply or suggest. And then adjusted real income, meaning, it doesn't tell us a lot if the average salary of someone in a given country is 1,000,000 pesos a year. What tells us more is, adjusted real income, meaning how much does the average salary afford someone? Is it enough for people to sustain themselves at a good quality of life? So looking at those three things is a shorthand to try to be as comprehensive as the 9 objectives. But so number 3 is more comprehensive than number 1. Number 2 is the most comprehensive of the 3. This first half of the chapter talks about other things having to do with economics of Latin America. Some of these things we've touched on before. The international financial cycle and the natural, quote unquote, natural boom and bust simply means that capitalism, it is very normal or common for capitalism left alone for there to be booms and busts. We tend to prefer economic stability, but inevitably capitalism has booms and busts. And these booms and busts tend to be augmented in Latin America because during good times, the first world is investing into opportunities in Latin America. But when there are busts, when there's a recession, when there's a depression, that gets augmented because in addition to having that recession in Latin America, it gets augmented by all the investment that also gets pulled out of there. And so they can have bigger booms and busts. In the 20th century, we're going to learn a few things about the 20th century. One of the big things happening in the 20th century during the second half was the Cold War. And so some of these things are connected to the Cold War. The Alliance for Progress, for example, was when grants were given to help Latin American countries to maintain economic stability. But Clawson introduces us to the fact that it wasn't just out of the goodness of the hearts of these banks, especially banks from the United States. This was also an effort to stop the spread of communism during the Cold War. The 1980s in particular were a difficult economic decade in Latin America. Hence, it's referred to as the lost decade. A decade in which lots of Latin American countries were struggling economically. One of the reasons why they were struggling was due to foreign indebtedness. In a previous chapter, we talked about nationalization and privatization. And with nationalization, with nationalized industries is when countries make public, let's say they have a lot of oil in their country. If a country nationalizes it, means that they create a government company that manages that oil and try and subsidize the cost of that oil for the public. And But this can be true of a lot of different industries, not just things like oil. It could be transportation. It could be public transportation. Uh, like subways or buses or rail systems or even airlines. But government, state-owned companies have a history of a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of inefficiency, and some would argue also even a lot of corruption. And so these companies, these countries ended up falling into debt because they were either because of state-owned companies or because they were subsidizing certain industries to a point where they couldn't afford it. They ended up going into debt in order to continue to provide those services. And so again, it could be like providing affordable public transportation, or it could be, subsidizing vegetables, fruits and vegetables, so that the public can eat. And so at any rate, there's a lot of countries that fell into a lot of debt, subsidizing things that they weren't able to afford to subsidize anymore. And so they fell into debt. A couple ways that they were affected during the last decade. One is inflation, the rate of loss of purchasing power, where so inflation. And there are, like a lot of us in the United States have felt the effects of inflation that have happened, during and after the pandemic. And lots of parts of the world have felt that. But in the US, I think we ended up having like a 10% inflation. Maybe at some points it was higher, maybe 20. Latin America in the 1980s was experiencing, there are places that are experiencing 100% inflation in 1 month. Imagine that everything that you currently spend on is double that price by the end of the month. And your salary, your income didn't double by the end of the month. And so how can you afford everything you afford? There were some places in Latin America that had 500%, even 1,000% increase in the course of a year. Just unimaginable rates of inflation in the 1980s. And that also helps us understand why there were many places in Latin America in the 1980s that tried to, immigrate to first world countries like the United States, where there was more economic stability and they could survive. Related to that is also currency devaluation. And so, and that also can affect the international exchange rate with currency devaluation. That relates to inflation. And so, like, I remember going to Mexico in the 1980s. And, as a kid, I would go to the little corner market and buy like chips and a soda. And it would cost like 600 pesos. And so as a child, I'm dealing with transactions that are in the hundreds. And that happened because of the inflation. Now imagine adults, they were dealing in transactions of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and occasionally in the millions for everyday transactions. So imagine paying for a bag of chips and a soda with $600. Pretty soon we start needing $1,000 bills, $10,000 bills, you know, etc., $100,000 bills. And so one of the ways that countries dealt with that was simply it's called remuneration, where all their bills, they came out with a new, in the case of Mexico, they came out with a new peso. And the new peso, one new peso was worth 1,000 old pesos. All they did was cut the zeros, 3 zeros out of every bill to come up with the new ones. And that just made it so that, you know, you know, how do I put this? It just made it so you're dealing with smaller numbers. The old pesos were still worth the same. It's not like they became worth 1,000 more than before. So that's, you know, so that now, for example, $1 is worth a little less than 20, so usually between 15 and 20 pesos, instead of hundreds, like it was in the 80s. In the first half of chapter 13, there's this Human Development Index ratings or rankings. Let's see, first thing is make sure you read them, you read the table correctly, where the lower the ranking, how do I say, the larger the number, the lower the ranking. So, you know, if you're, say, number 1, like Norway here, you know, that means it's the highest ranked in the world, number 1. And then the other thing is, if you're looking for the 3 countries in Latin America with who is ranked the lowest, and again, this is counterintuitive because of the numbers, but you know, the highest ranking again is the lowest number. Like Norway is the highest ranked. The lowest ranked in Latin America has the highest numbers, and that's not El Salvador, Bolivia, and Guyana, because the table continues up here. It's Guatemala, Honduras, and Haiti. So do make sure that you read the table correctly. Number 1, don't read it backwards. And number 2, notice that the table continues on the second column. It doesn't end at the bottom of this first column. So Clawson uses numbers from 2015, where the lowest ranked, again, Guatemala, Honduras, and Haiti. And so here we have them, Haiti, Honduras, and Guatemala. And here I have some updated numbers for those countries. And they're still, well, as of 2021, still the lowest ranked in Latin America, lowest ranked, highest number. What about the highest ranked? In 2015, it was Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. More recent numbers in 2021, Chile overtook Argentina. Argentina became second place. Uruguay was still in third. And if we were to add a fourth, Costa Rica would be number 4. How does the United States compare? In 2015, the United States was number 8, highest ranked. By 2021, the United States had dropped to number 21. Still higher than the highest Latin American country, but the US dropped a lot between 2015 and 2021. All right, so when countries in Latin America fell into a lot of debt, there was a debt crisis. And this would not only affect Latin America, this could affect the whole world. Because when they fell in debt to banks from the first world, and especially from the United States. So if Latin American countries were not able to pay their payments on their debt, that was going to affect US banks and banks in other parts of the world. So helping Latin American countries that had a debt crisis was in the interest of the United States and the rest of the world because of that potential for a world economic downturn. So here's a couple different plans we get introduced to. One was the Baker Plan to give more loans and buy more time for these Latin American countries to be able to pay off, make payments on their debt. Then after that came the Brady Plan, which gave a variety of debt relief measures. Clawson argues that the Brady Plan was more effective than the Baker Plan. And so a lot of that, part of that had to do with conditionality, meaning, okay, we are going to give you a loan or give you some loan forgiveness, but you have to fulfill certain conditions. It could be things like, your bureaucracy needs to be more open. Your state companies need to, again, be more open, or your elections need to be more open so that there's transparency, so that we know there isn't corruption. But more likely and more often, it was things like, okay, you have a state park, a national park. You need to open that to multinational corporations to be able to chop the trees down or mine in that national park. Okay, you have oil and the state-owned oil company where you need to privatize that and sell it to a that will run it privately. If they had, say, a government-owned airline or a government-owned multimedia company, then they needed to sell that out. Now, the logic is that, well, initially the logic is they sell those things to private companies, and the money from those sales will help pay off the loans. The other part of the logic is that private companies are likely to run more efficiently because they have the profit incentive, as opposed to a state-owned company where, they make money and they exist regardless of how profitable they are. And so that's the logic. But part of the issue is that this logic only ends up being true if there aren't monopolies. So let's say there's let's say, for example, that the state owns all the cable lines, the telephone lines, which did happen. There were cases where that was the case. If they sell that to just one company, a private company, even if it's a private company, if that private company has a monopoly, then it doesn't have the incentive to be efficient and low cost because it's not competing with anyone. It has a monopoly. It's the only, if anyone wants a phone line or a cable, that's the one company they have to go with. And so there wasn't an incentive for them to be run efficiently and affordably like private entities can if they have competition. With all that said, things did get better in the 1990s, hence it's referred to as the found decade, as opposed to the lost decade of the 1980s. In a previous chapter, we got introduced to these things. And so I'll repeat and summarize the Bracero program, the border industrialization program briefly. And then this time I'll talk about NAFTA more than before. So again, the Bracero program an agreement between the United States and Mexico that started during World War II, intended to only be during World War II, because the United States had a labor shortage during World War II. So the two countries agreed to bring in Mexican workers to the United States to work in agriculture and railroads. Now, agriculture in particularly liked the Bracero program so much that they lobbied Congress to renew the Bracero program year after year, way beyond the end of World War II in 1945, all the way until 1964. The Bracero program did not have any maquiladoras. The Bracero program was people working in agriculture and farms and railroads. The maquiladoras begin with the border industrialization program the following year, 1965. This was created by Mexico, where they would allow US companies to move right across the US-Mexico border. They had to be within a certain number of miles of the US-Mexico border. I think it was 10 miles. And so US companies could build assembly plants or factories. That is what is called a maquiladora in Spanish. And so US companies would build them in Mexico, and they were able to take advantage of lower taxes, less environmental protections, less labor rights, lower wages, less protections for labor. They were able to take advantage of all those things in Mexico, and then ship the finalized products back into the United States without having to pay a tariff. And so that is from 1965 to 1993. Those maquiladoras had to be along the US-Mexico border, and they had to have Mexican ownership. There was, I think it was 27% Mexican ownership that was required in these maquiladoras. But then there was NAFTA in 1994, January 1st, 1994 until 2020. That's the North American Free Trade Agreement. This was an agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico to allow for the free movement of products and money across borders of the three countries without tariffs. Now, there in Mexico, there was a group called the Zapatistas. These were Mayan people who named themselves after the Mexican revolutionary general from over 100 years ago, from the 1910s. They named themselves after him because they were indigenous people. In this case, they were Mayans in southern Mexico that ended up going in rebellion, armed rebellion against the Mexican government because of NAFTA. They knew that Mexico had to stop subsidizing corn for all the people who lived on growing corn like they had for millennia. And so then people who farmed corn were not going to be able to compete with US agribusiness corn, and that the US government was allowed to continue subsidizing. So they knew that they were going to lose their livelihood, their connection to the land and to the growing of corn. I'll remind you that corn is not only a staple food item in Mexico, meaning it's kind of hard to have a meal in Mexico and not have corn be in there somewhere. It's super common. And so, you know, in that sense, it's really important. But to the Mayans, they have a sacred origin story that's called the Popol Vuh. Sorry for this. Try again here. It'd be kind of like a parallel to the Christian Bible's oh, what is it? Right now I'm blanking out. I think it's the book of Genesis. And so, it's an origin story. And so for the Mayans, it's not just an important food, but people themselves came from corn. And so it's important to the origin story of the Mayan people, period. And like I mentioned before, there were people who used to subsist on growing and working in farms and growing corn and beans. They were no longer able to, sort of the market price for corn became so low that they couldn't compete. They couldn't sell their stuff and the government was no longer subsidizing it. So they moved from rural areas to urban areas. And they also moved to along the US-Mexico border where the majority of the maquiladoras were. When they would get to the maquiladoras to try to find work, they would hire 80% women. So these families that would move to the US-Mexico border to get work, only the women would get hired. And even then, it would only be women under the age of 25. Because they had no labor protections, it would only be young women who would be employed. Older women would be fired for any reason, including just for getting pregnant or just not being young enough. So this created a lot of unemployed men in particular. And then there was a lot of undocumented immigration to the United States in the 1990s. One of the largest waves of undocumented immigration since the 1920s. And part of this could have been foreseen, because if we look at different trade agreements between different countries in different parts of the world, like, for example, the European Union, we see that these trade agreements not only allow for the free movement of products and capital, they also allow for the possibility that there's going to be changing or shifting labor demands within these countries. And so people are going to need to move to where the work is as well. A lot of these women that were working in factories 24 hours a day, there were 3 8-hour shifts with the factories running 24 hours a day, were being bussed in. They ended up becoming the targets of violence, especially by drug cartels. And there were, so here's pictures of those different assembly plants in the maquiladoras. This is with regard to the femicides of women who died. There were 327 who were found dead, but there were 4,000 that disappeared. But after this came the Mexican president, who started using the Mexican military to fight the drug cartels. And then there was just greater general violence throughout the country. And everyone forgot about the women who had been targeted before the drug war began. I mentioned the Zapatistas and the Mayan people who rebelled against the Mexican government. I'll show you a clip of this group so you can visualize them. They have a very distinct look.
Pero dicen los compañeros, la única condición que nosotros entregaríamos las armas es humanos. Así es que el problema de la guerra no es la tenencia de armas, sino de su uso. Estamos dispuestos acelere el uso. O sea, dejar de usarlas durante un tiempo para siempre, pues, pero nunca entregarlas. Porque ya hay mucha explotación, mucha injusticia. Ya no lo soportamos. ¿Sí? Y es por eso, pues, a partir del 1 de enero, pues, no nos quedó otro remedio, pues, más que agarrar tus armas. Porque las tierras son para quienes las trabajan. Decidimos la guerra para tener la tierra.
Okay, so again, the Zapatistas named themselves after Emiliano Zapata. The organization that they're a part of. Sort of a marker. There it goes. The organization they were part of was the EZLN, Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, the Zapatista Army for National Liberation. They were in southern Mexico in the Mexican state of Chiapas. Yeah. Some of the keywords with regard to that. So NAFTA, how is NAFTA different from the border industrialization program? Those maquiladoras no longer were limited to just along the US-Mexico border. They can now be in any part of Mexico. They also no longer required any Mexican ownership. They could now be 100% US owned in Mexico. Was NAFTA good or bad? Who benefited from it? NAFTA, after all this time, we can see that NAFTA was good for Wall Street investors. It was not good for workers in the US or Mexico. It was not good for workers in the United States because a lot of factories, including certainly in the Midwest, a lot of factories left the United States to go to Mexico to open up over there for, to have cheaper wages, to not have to protect the environment, etc. And in Mexico, again, it did create jobs, but it created a lot of instability with all the people who lost their livelihood in farming and then weren't able to be employed in the new factories and the new jobs that were created. And then NAFTA was updated in 2020. Since then, it became USMCA, just for United States, Mexico, and Canada. An agreement kind of an updating that was led by President Trump in his first administration. And these are some of the main changes that were required in USMCA, requiring more labor rights, having a higher country of origin requirement, meaning, in order to say something is made in the USA, they need at least a certain percentage of the components to actually be made in the USA, for example. He also pressured Canada to buy more dairy from the United States, so that benefits us in Wisconsin, being a dairy state. Allowed for greater protections for intellectual property and digital product creators, so basically cracking down on piracy, or an attempt at cracking down at piracy. And USMCA comes with built-in reviews every 6 years and an expiration after 16. And so you can't just, with this, it's not just an agreement until they decide to renegotiate it. Built into it is that it's going to be reviewed every 6 years and then expires after 16. And this is, these are this example are examples of many economic unions or trade agreements between countries in Latin America. There's been efforts to create a Latin America-wide economic union or trade agreement, but that's never materialized. What has materialized is smaller ones, like the Central American Common Market, referred to as CAFTA, or the Andean Community and Caribbean Community Union, CARICOM, or the Southern Cone Common Market, Mercado Sur or Mercosur. So these are trade agreements throughout Latin America that have materialized, but not Latin America-wide. Again, there's efforts to create something like a free trade of the Americas. And I think this might be its early logo, but that hasn't materialized. There was also efforts to create a Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and Colombia. That did materialize. Something that's been in the works is TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The TPP has been in progress since 2009, still not implemented. It set out to make the world's largest free trade deal, including 40% of the global economy. It was going to include 12 countries in the Americas and in Asia. But then Trump, in his first administration, withdrew the United States from the TPP in 2017. And as you are aware, our relationship with China has continued to diminish or worsen. So there's even less possibilities for the US to be part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was in the works prior to that. There are lots, you don't have to really know this. This is just showing, how there's the countries are represented by the flags and how individual countries have agreements with a lot of different organizations. This OAS is Organization of American States. But that one I don't think is a trade agreement. That's more an organization to work with other countries in the Americas. Kind of a final note on this would be the current state of tariffs, because it's interesting that for the last few decades, for the last half century, the United States has been pressuring or, encouraging Latin American countries to privatize and to globalize, to become globally competitive and eliminating these economic barriers and tariffs. And with the Trump administration, well, no, that's not fair. Since the first Trump administration, and to some degree, including the Biden administration, and then definitely now with the second Trump administration, we've been moving in the opposite direction of putting up trade barriers in the form of tariffs, something that we had been moving away from for at least a half century. And so it's an interesting economic point in time that we're at, and that we're making an about turn in what we had done historically.